You've got the water boiling, you've got the water running, you've got something on medium, you've got something on high. It's a concert, and you have to keep things going. And in the back of your mind, you have to realize, you're also filling a canister with water. You can't let it overflow. And conversely, you've got to pay attention to your supply.
What if one conversation could save a life? What if one new process or new product could save a patient from surgical harm? Broadcasting from a hospital basement near you, you are listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the global voice of sterile processing. Each week we spotlight the best practices, products and people from around the world who are disrupting our profession and helping you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Join us as we have the kinds of conversation that matter and give our industry the kind of voice that it deserves. Nyt on aika mennä puhdastakin puhtaammaksi. And now it's time to go beyond clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Tom Overby, president at Sprint Multimedia, currently consulting with Isham, soon to be HSPA by the time this podcast released. And we're going to be talking about ultrasonic cleaning today, Hank, and also, and probably more in depth, an overview of enzymatic detergents and the chemicals that are utilized in these cleaning solutions. We're going to get a nice deep dive. We're going to get really granular today. And I think everybody is going to learn a lot about maybe some of the components of these detergents that they use that they didn't realize how the magic happens.
That's right, Justin. And I want to get to we shouldn't have done that, or maybe we should have been doing this, to really connect the dots or connect the water drops, if you will, in this conversation. Because again, the whole season we're going to be talking about chemicals, and there's a lot of different places in our workflow that we use chemicals. There's a lot of equipment that we use chemicals in. And this ultrasonic piece is such a critical part of that workflow for many of our departments. So really looking forward to this conversation today.
All right. We're going to be right back after a short break with Tom Overby. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Tom Overby, president at Sprint Multimedia, currently consulting with Isham, soon to be known as HSPA. And Tom, the last time, or not the last time we saw you, but I would say one of the most impactful things that we ever partnered on with was our myth-busting series.
Right.
And you did all of the video work for us on that and putting it out. And we still hear about that event and how impactful it was. And I know it lives on because of the video work that you did that's up on the YouTube channel. So it's been a while, but if anybody hasn't seen either of the myth busting because they're new to Beyond Clean, they should check it out. But Tom, it's great to reconnect with you. And you are a previous guest also on Beyond Clean. And we talked about ultrasonics at the time, but we're going to continue to have a similar conversation, but take a little bit deeper dive today. Thanks so much for coming on.
Absolutely love to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to be talking about all things ultrasonic, cavitation, chemicals, cleaning, etc. But before we do that, I read your title as the president at Sprint Multimedia, and you talked about, or I mentioned your consulting engagement with Isham HSPA. And I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the work you do in the media world and also your current engagement with Isham.
Well, thanks. So basically, Sprint Multimedia has been around for many, many years. And basically, I got my start in the surgical arena. Maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. Ultimately, I came over to the sterile processing side. Anyway, years ago, I've done all kinds of marketing and media presentations, mostly on the educational side of things. Things grew to where I was flying around the country doing videos of heart surgeries. So including flying to Rome and Canada and various parts of the world. So it's pretty fascinating. But fast forwarding to today, I do a lot of work with Isham. And I do a couple of things of interest. I create videos for Isham. interesting that you ask. I've recently completed a conference opening video, although there wasn't a conference this year, but it must resonate with folks because it's been out for about 2 or 3 weeks and it's well over 50,000 views. So it's a nice tribute to the sterile processing profession. And that's what I like to do, is create videos that resonate for people, not just on the marketing side of things. But another thing I do with Isham is also, I guess you might consider me a chapter strategist, because I am helping the chapters reinvigorate themselves in a sense. Let's face it, COVID has affected everybody and everything. And so I have this platform that I help to shell out called Remo for the state chapters to utilize themselves. And I help them to execute the events, onboard the speakers, and a number of things to make their events go well. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
And I think I remember this correctly, but you'll have to tell me if I have it a little bit off. I believe you were involved in the very first live streaming of a surgical procedure. Is that correct?
Very good. Excellent. Man. Yeah, no, it was out of a Good Samaritan Hospital in Portland, Oregon. We did the first live surgical hybrid case, actually, and it was intended to be ported directly to iPhones, as that was the first device at the time. This was around 2008. So very good memory. Very good memory. That was fascinating. I mean, we did a CABG surgery, so cardiac bypass. And they used the Da Vinci robot then. And that was my introduction to some of the Da Vinci folks at Intuitive. And then the patient laid there on the table. And then after about 40 minutes, maybe it wasn't that long. I don't recall exactly, but it wasn't too terribly long. And then a cardiology crew came in and then deployed 2 or 3 stents in the same patient the same day in the same operating room. So it was fascinating all the way around. And we were having people from, like I said, 2008, having people from all over the world chime in and ask questions. It was quite an experience. Thanks for recalling that.
Yeah, it's such a cool story. And I know that you used to do a really awesome newsletter, and it kind of leads us to the conversation today because it's very much around ultrasonic cleaning. And I thought maybe you could kind of kick off the conversation by telling us, or reminding the audience, I'm sure many are very well aware, but what is ultrasonic cleaning and why, or even are chemicals necessary in that process?
Right. They're 2 very interrelated pieces, but the primary work, of course, that's being done is through cavitation. It sounds like kind of like a hard word there, cavitation. What the heck does that mean? Basically, it relates to sound energy, but it's sound energy through water. So let's think about this for a second. I always like to talk to people in terms of example. And you have a wine glass, let's say, okay? I don't have one with me, but if you have a wine glass, I should though, you can tink the glass and it rings. It resonates at a certain pitch that you might find on a flute, on a piano. You could match that same pitch. And when you match that same pitch, the glass can actually resonate, actually mimic the sound of itself with the sound of some other source that's at that same pitch. And then, of course, you may think that's, you know where I'm going with this, is that if the opera singer lady or whomever is singing that exact pitch with such intensity, that glass breaks. And so if you think about that, we're not talking about trying to sing it at surgical instruments and trying to get them to break, but there's a very interesting property with stainless steel. It also has a resonant property to it. Just like if you're singing in the bathroom and you've got your reverberant sound singing, reverberating in your bathroom, there's resonance going on. The air is vibrating at some pitch that's relative to the shape, the size of whatever it is that's being affected. Now, how do we make these sounds? Well, if you're listening to this podcast, you're listening to it through speakers. And those speakers are transducers. They're vibrating through variances in electrical pulses, causing the airwaves to push and pull in a certain frequency. a low frequency, you have airwaves that vibrate very slowly, or less number of times, less number of vibrations per second. And if you talk about something like an instrument, like a flute, way high on up there in terms of pitch, those airwaves are vibrating very, very quickly, causing your ear, the inner ear, to fluctuate very quickly. And it responds, it resonates to that same sound that you're hearing, and that's how you hear these sounds. But what's interesting is when you put this in water, and the musical instrument in an ultrasonic machine happens to be called a generator. So we have flutes, we have bass guitars, but in water and ultrasonic world, we have a generator, just like an electronic keyboard can make a sound. And when you put a high intensity sound in water, something marvelous and miraculous seemingly happens. And these gaseous bubbles begin to form where normally gas wouldn't exist. And so when you disrupt the water in a basin, what happens is that this gaseous bubble exists for a very brief moment in time. And when that happens, the bubble basically implodes. It goes away. The water wants to rush back into itself where that space, where that air was. When that happens, that creates a really very miniature but very intense pulse of energy. As a matter of fact, if you could create a cavitational event that just extended itself out in a length of time, it would basically melt the machine down to the floor. It's been documented that these cavitation bubbles in a very infinitesimally small period in time can actually equate to the temperature of the sun. So we're talking about some serious stuff here. But the thing about the instruments is because they resonate to the sound that's being emanated from the generator, it's basically shaking. It's very erratic. It's kind of like it is causing bioburden to be removed from instruments. And that, my friends, is basically a nutshell on how this marvelous piece of machinery works. So let's definitely give credit due where it's due.
Right. So, Tom, the theme of this season obviously is chemicals, the chemical epicenter. That description that you provided didn't include any chemical besides water. I guess if you want to call water a chemical, it is a compound, I guess. But what role then does these ultrasonic chemistries play in the cleaning process if, by definition, cavitation cleans without it?
Well, that's interesting, Hank, because you mentioned water, and it is a chemical. And actually water, the propensity of water, the ability for water to do great cleaning by itself is a very good thing. It does do work. But of course, we know that working in the field, specific detergents like enzymatic detergents do a great job. I mean, there's all kinds of detergents out there. There's alkaline-based detergents. There's acidic detergents out there, which normally aren't necessarily recommended for instruments per se, except under special circumstances. But the real winner of the day is an enzymatic detergent. And in conjunction of that, working with cavitation, it does great things.
Is there something like special to that? Like again, is it the enzymatic working while the instruments are just submerged? Is it in conjunction with the cavitation process? Is there something that happens with those enzymes that doesn't just happen in a regular, soaking environment, for instance? Or is it something else?
Well, it's multiple things, actually. Now, when we have an enzymatic detergent, we mean we have enzymes in the detergent, and there's usually most common in detergent is a triple enzymatic detergent, which consists of 3 enzymes in there: protease, protein, which is good for eradicating and affecting proteins, blood and tissue. Then there's lipase, lipids, lipase, so fats, that helps with that. And then there's amylase, which is helping to eliminate starches like bronchial mucus and things of that sort. So these enzymatic properties actually are, like, for lack of a better term, like little critters in there that's actually munching and actually dissolving, basically digesting. It's a digesting property. I mean, this is what's going on in the bowels of a cavitation machine, aka ultrasonic machine.
So if we were to put you on the spot here and say, what is the Tom Overby recommended chemical to be using in ultrasonic cleaners? What I'm hearing you say is you would lean toward this triple enzymatic detergent, right? That's built. Is that a unique chemical that's made to go in ultrasonic cleaners? Or is it the same type of enzyme detergent that can also be used in the manual cleaning sink, for instance?
Yes, you can certainly use that in a manual cleaning instance. One of the first thing that pops in my mind, Hank, is when those instruments from point of use come down to decontam and they're sitting there, they need to be defoamed if they haven't been already in OR. And that's typically an enzymatic constituent that's actually helping, again, pre-clean the instruments. And of course, incidentally, the pre-cleaning process is paramount to cleaning an ultrasonic machine, may I add, because if the ultrasonic machine receives dirty instruments, then what's the point? It's not a miracle worker per se.
That's an important point here, right? Because that was one of my other kind of background questions, maybe if we had time to get to, but I'm going to bring it up now since you mentioned that. It's kind of that stage in the workflow that we should be looking at ultrasonic cleaners, and to the point that you just mentioned, it shouldn't be with this gross debris that is, potentially visible, right? So like, would you say that standard is if you can still see the gunk and the junk on it, that it probably has not been properly pre-cleaned enough or manually cleaned? Is that the standard?
That's absolutely the case. And I'm not tattling on anybody, but I've seen it happen where there is gross debris on instruments. And I was in a decontam department visiting. So I'm on somebody else's turf and I politely, pointed and it was very clear. So these instruments were taken out and cleaned. So, but, I always, again, like I said earlier, I always like to talk about example by example. And we do dishes at home, right? And we have a dishwasher. I mean, it's a cleaner. And we all know where this can go. If you have egg on a plate and it's denatured, it's stuck on a plate, and you put that in the dishwasher, it's not coming off. So you need to pre-clean your instruments,
You're stepping in it now, Tom.
Yes.
That's a national debate between husband and wives. Do we pre-clean or not?
Okay. All right. Let's put it this way. It depends on how long you take before you get the dishes in the dishwasher. Okay. So if those instruments are in decontam and they're just sitting there, and we all know that happens because, life happens when you're in decontam. You don't get to everything all the time, all at once.
That point about the gross soil is a huge issue, right? Like you've seen it, I've seen it, we've all seen it. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the other common errors or misconceptions around ultrasonic cleaning in general, but in particular, again, this question about chemical use in conjunction with this machine. Like, what are the things that you've seen in the field or that you've had conversations around that is just not as well understood in the industry as it should be?
Well, there's a couple of things there, Hank. It really goes back to training. And as a side note, I mean, and we all have seen things that should be done better, things that aren't done that should be done, period. I've seen things in ultrasonic machines that shouldn't have been in there, and I've seen things that maybe are, too much of a good thing is not a good thing, too many instruments being put in. So it boils down to the proper practices. And that's all done through education, training. We all know that, following IFUs, we can't preach that enough. As far as chemicals go, of course, I think one of the biggest concerns is it's not a set it and forget it kind of scenario. lifeline to cleanliness is the detergents. They work very much in tandem with cavitation. So making sure that your plumbing from your supply room is good, making sure your supply room has detergent. I've heard several many cases where, whoops, we discovered that our chemical supply ran dry.
A couple of weeks ago. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, that happens all the time. That's
right.
a great point.
You have to be it has to be ever present in your mind, at least to some extent. Again, I'm sorry, I'm back into the kitchen again, but you've got the water boiling, you've got, the water running, you've got something on medium, you've got something on high. It's a concert, and you have to keep things going. And in the back of your mind, you have to realize, you're also filling a canister with water. You can't let it overflow. And conversely, you've got to pay attention to your supply. Also making sure that you're using the right chemical. And for goodness sakes, never mix chemistries. If you're not sure and you're running low on a chemistry and you've got a different supplier that supplies another chemistry, don't mix them. Don't think that you can just replace one with the other. I'm not sure how often that happens, but that's something that, it's like taking shortcuts or assuming too much. Another thing is don't assume that more is better. Don't just, particularly for machines where you're delivering your dosing by hand. You have a beaker and you're putting detergent in and you feel like, well, let's just put a little extra in, or there's only a little extra left in the bottle. That doesn't necessarily work well. And it also makes it harder to rinse instruments too when you have all this residual. And, maybe we'll talk about that.
I always thought that was a contributor to TAS, because when they were doing flashing and they were open flashing and they were turning the sets around, I always felt like, and I realized it's not caused, TAS is just kind of a generalized infection. It's not an actual bacteria. It's not like a MRSA or anything like that. It's more of a condition of inflammation of the eye, right? But I always thought it was this residual enzymatic because, as you said, it starts to break down proteins. And so if you're doing open flashing and you have a really crazy, and it popped up in eye surgery centers, and my wife actually worked in an eye surgery center as a surgical tech, they're cranking that through. So if you don't have really good control, and at the time they also didn't have the dispensing mechanisms, and everybody was using the pump, and they were like, more is better. And I always thought, and I realize it's not ultrasonic related, but I always thought that residual enzymatic, on this topic, was actually probably being left on the instrument in some way. And then when you open flash, the instrument can still be wet, right?
Right.
And then that would introduce enzymatic, residual on the instrument in a fluid state into the eye. And then of course it begins to break down proteins. And I don't know that I ever read anything about it. And I know it's kind of, it's just a guess or an assumption on my side. But when you look at the quality controls around distribution of enzymatic at the time that those outbreaks were happening, it's not a conclusion, but it's definitely a theory that I've had in my mind for that. And, instruments get slippery when the enzymatic doesn't get rinsed off. Like there's, lots of issues with that. So.
Oh, no, absolutely. I am certain that TAS is a byproduct of enzymatic detergents not being rinsed thoroughly off of instruments. Can you imagine putting, laundry detergent in your eye? Come on, it's paramount that you make sure that your instruments are thoroughly rinsed, but also consider the fact of lumens, because those detergent residuals can just remain in the lumens and you don't even know they're there. The instrument can look totally clean and spotless with water beading on the instrument. So that's basically making sure your instruments are rinsed is paramount to good cleanliness. The instruments may be clean, but if they have detergent on them, they're not.
Right. That's a really good point, because people think dirty means, something like bioburden or rust, right? And because the detergent is a cleaning solution, people might not associate it with being dirty, but it is dirty because it's something foreign that's not supposed to be on there.
Right.
So along those same lines, Tom, why don't you kind of take us down, a little bit of a description of surfactants and the roles that they play?
Great, Justin. That's a good topic too, because, basic constituent of detergents is water. We already said that does a great job. Water by itself, it does okay. And then we talked about the enzymes, basically digesting the various bioburden properties. So that's helping it be broken down. But so we have another property in detergents called surfactants. And it's basically short for surface acting agents. Okay. And so if you think about it, if you have a freshly waxed car, okay, and you have, or it's rained on a freshly waxed car, you see the water really beating up. It's got a very nice round edge to it. The water has its own surface, its own body. It's called surface tension. And it doesn't like run all over the car. It's very well formed, like a water droplet. Okay. So when you have an instrument and you have water droplets forming on your instrument, well, wherever the droplet is where the water is, but where the droplet isn't is where there is no cleaning properties or water present. So what a surfactant is, it goes in and it helps to break up the water surface tension so it can evenly surround the instrument and clean the instrument.
So Tom, on that topic of the interplay between these different chemicals or chemical types, as you're describing them, obviously there's got to be some impact, at the end of the process that would signal, hey, something that we're doing in this chemical process, in this ultrasonic process, may not be working. What are some of those warning signs or red flags that would kind of tee off a user to say, hey, maybe I should check the dilution, the dosing rate, the chemical type that I'm using, the water quality? Like, what are those things that you would see on the equipment or in the equipment or on the instruments that would kind of key you into that potential problem?
Gotcha. Yeah. And going in the order of things, we left the topic of rinsing and TAS and that sort of thing. First off, I just want to say, if you have residual detergent on an instrument, aside from the health implications, which are terrible, that's where a vast amount of issues can occur with dirty water or hard water, and residual detergent remaining on the instrument is a very common cause of pitting and staining, which can very much shorten the lifespan of your instrument. And nobody wants that. But specifically, when you're talking about dosing and things of that sort, it's the unknowns that are of utmost concern. And whether your machine has lost calibration. This is why biomedical is your friend, and making sure that you stay up on your preventative maintenance program. You like to take care of your car and you like to change the fluids in your car, and it's an investment, such as with the hospital facilities investing in their patients and their lives and their machines and instruments too. So different manufacturers have different means with which the way they dose their detergents, and with varying degrees of accuracy, but still at the end of the day, getting the instruments, clean. But you still have to make sure that your instruments are also well connected too, particularly your lumens.
So what do you mean when you say that, like well connected? Like, can you just specify?
Yeah. So lumens are tubular type instruments, hollowed tubed instruments. They get flushed. And so there's a variety of lure locks and other types of apparatus that you connect your instruments together to be able to receive a flush or flushing process. So you have to make sure everything's nicely, tightly connected so that it becomes part of the flow, part of the continuum of cleaning.
Yeah. So to go back, to your surfactant, definition, and just the allusion to, hey, if the chemical is not making contact, then it's not able to do its job. And so in this lumen conversation, if they're not connected and you don't have chemicals flowing through them, through this stage and through this process, then you're actually not doing what you think you're doing, right?
Exactly.
So maybe to pull us back to a conversation around the rinsing related to TAS, This is more kind of a general ultrasonic question, but I'm going to tie it into the chemical piece. And it's the question of rinsing after the cycle. Can you give some insight from an industry insider and expert on this topic of what's the big deal with rinsing? Why is it required? Is there equipment out there today that does the rinsing for you? Like, I think when I talk to a lot of folks in decontam through audits and such, they almost always tell me, yeah, like our unit rinses them. And so when it's done, it's just ready to go directly on to the next stage in the process. And I kind of scratch my head sometimes and say, well, it may be doing something, but I'm not sure that it's accomplishing what the industry recommendations out there are putting out in terms of why you should rinse. So stab anywhere you want on that thing, but give us a little insight.
Well, it falls back to, you mentioned TAS again. It really falls back to good cleaning protocols. When your instruments are done, they should have zero residual anything, bioburden, detergent, anything should be completely eliminated from those devices. And I would also throw out there that a lot of facilities, I think, could stand to make sure and be more attuned to AAMI guidelines and drain after every process. That's a key thing here. Just like your dishwasher, it cleans your dishes and it drains. And then you open it up and, you take out your dishes and it's ready for the next run. And that would be my response to, aside from whatever we're talking about industry wise, but in the facility, I would definitely advocate draining after each process. That way you're sure that you're getting clean water the next time. The other thing that's important about detergents, I would just state, is the chelating agents. And the chelating agents are another additive to detergents, to just for you guys, are added in there for hard water instances, because hard water depletes the efficacy of the detergent, of the enzymes. And so there's another constituent in there to help out in those hard times, the hard water.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that piece about the draining, the piece about the rinsing, all of it, to your point, is still connected with the chemicals, because we're using chemicals in there. And either if you're not draining on a regular basis, and those chemicals are not good forever, right? They only have a small window of active use. I'm sure there's a more technical term than that. But, the rinsing piece, obviously we don't want them continuing on that instrument through the process, as we've talked about before. So yeah, that's great insight.
All right, Tom, really nice job. Great to have you back. And as always, the time flies. Thanks for coming on the show.
Sure. No, it's been a pleasure. Always.
That was Tom Overby, president at Sprint Multimedia, currently consulting with HSPA. And this is the epicenter of chemical season on Beyond Clean. And today's conversation with Tom Overby really started us with ultrasonic cleaning, but then went into enzymatic detergents. We talked about surfactants. And, Hank, you said at the end, there's nobody else that we'd rather talk to about chemicals in ultrasonic cleaners than Tom Overby. He's an expert. And I'm glad that I remembered about that very first procedure being live streamed. And I did forget, and he corrected me, that they were streaming to iPhones, which also makes it sound even that much more cutting edge for some reason. But Tom's been an innovator in the industry, always willing to share his insights and doing some great work in his collaboration with HSPA.
Yeah, Justin, you are so proud of yourself that you remembered something, and I'm so happy for you. No.
He talked about eating the elephant. I just want you to know he's talking about my memory.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we don't just keep Justin around for ear candy. He can also remember things occasionally. But outside of that, yes, I totally agree. It's well past time to get Tom back in the studio. And what a great conversation. We love these kinds of introduction conversations, though, to just scratch the surface for ultrasonic cleaning and the relation to chemicals, because there's so much more to talk about that really gets into the practical aspect of our department lives, but then also the science behind how these chemicals are created, the equipment is created, those little generators that he mentioned as the musical instruments at the beginning of the episode. So much just great intro to spark that curiosity. And I hope that there are some folks out there today that are listening and saying, you know what? I want to go learn some more about that.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or just search for us on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes, but you got to download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. And on behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.